So the Chinese foreign minister, Mr. Qin Gang, was in India as part of the G20 Foreign Ministers Summit. And on the sidelines of the summit, he met with India's foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar. So this, what we are seeing here, is an automatic translation from Chinese to English. That's why the pronunciations and the spellings are not entirely correct. Uh, So, in his first meeting with Dr. Jaishankar, the new Chinese foreign minister calls for normalized border management. Since September last year, Chinese officials have been emphasizing that the border crisis is essentially over while calling for normalized border management. What happened? The Chinese are the ones who created the crisis in the first place. It was their actions that caused the crisis, the border standoff that has been ongoing for the past 3 years between India and China. There was the Galwan clash, which led to the deaths of soldiers on both sides, 20 Indians and 80 or 100 Chinese. Uh, so it is all, if a crisis has occurred, if a standoff has occurred, it's happened because of Chinese actions and provocations and belligerence and intransigence, not because of Indian actions. Now the Chinese are singing a different tune. They are calling for, thus far it is all diplomacy, it's all words. One hears that the situation is now less tense on the border. There are elements of a phased withdrawal that may be happening or may not be happening. One hears such things. So it looks like the Chinese now want a more normalized situation, a less tense, less hostile situation on the border. They want things to go back to normal. All indications are pointing in the direction. So the Chinese foreign minister he calls for normalized border management. Uh, Jaishankar meets new Chinese foreign minister, discusses border standoff. And Mr. Dr. Jaishankar obviously tweeted about this. As you can see, neither of them are all smiles. Mr. Dr. Jaishankar especially is making it a point not to smile. So clearly the situation is not friendly. Both these nations are still, well, you could consider them hostile to each other, but diplomacy is happening, the meeting is happening, it's being done in a very civilized diplomatic manner, but the body language and the facial expressions tell you the story that things are not normal. The Chinese want things to be normal, but things are not normal, and the ball is in the Chinese court. The onus is on China to make things right and take actions that demonstrate their intention to make things right. It's not India that has to withdraw from the occupied regions. It's not the Indians that have crossed the line. It's the Chinese that have done it. So if they want things to go back to normal, the onus is on them. So I am sure those things would have been discussed. Clearly somebody has realized he is not showing a very happy face. Yeah. uh, and then this is the Chinese statement from their foreign ministry about the meeting. So it's all diplomatic platitudes, more or less. What actually was discussed, everything will not be revealed over here. But the Chinese have given out a statement. It is in Chinese, actually. It's a Chinese language statement, which we can translate to a certain extent in English, machine translation. It won't be entirely accurate, but that's the statement. Okay, it's going to take time, so that's fine. Now, what's interesting is that the Chinese are now calling for an end to hostilities and for normalized border management. Thus far it's words, but maybe there could be some actual action on the ground. They may actually be taking steps to normalize the situation. We still don't know. We will wait for actual reports of that to emerge, but that's kind of what we are hearing, that things are less tense on the border. That's mainly the sense we are getting. So what happened? Why is this new tune being sung by the Chinese? So if you have been following me and this podcast and my pronouncements for the past couple of years, I have said one thing very consistently. I've said this on this channel, I've said this on other channels, in my interactions with other people as well, that 2024 is a defining year for India, also for the US, but we're talking about India. The general elections will be held in 24. A new government will come to power, or maybe the same government will come to power in a new form. That's what I mean, actually. Uh, So the Chinese, I said, do not want a strong Indian government to come to power in 2024. They would very much rather prefer a weak government to come to power, a coalition government that is easily malleable, a pliable government that will be much more pro China, softer towards China than what the Modi government is. So I have been saying this for the past 2 years. The Chinese would want a weak Indian government to come to power in 24. But that was before everything went wrong for China. See, the first thing that went wrong to China in the last 2 3 years is the coronavirus pandemic, the Wuhan virus pandemic. That has derailed the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative thoroughly. Nobody trusts China anymore. Nobody wants to cooperate with China and work with China in the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Maritime Silk Route, all those things. So China's great vehicle that would propel them to superpower status is gone. It is dead in the water. Secondly, the Chinese have not been able to make Russia their vassal state because India released the pressure valve, which was all the pressure that was building on Russia, by starting to import enormous quantities of Russian crude oil. So the Russians found this pressure release outlet, and because of that, they were not entirely isolated. The Americans would have expected that India would isolate Russia and bow down to American diktats. That's not happened. Because of that, Russia has not been forced to go beg to China for for assistance. So the Chinese economy is now crawling, it is going negative, it is contracting. China is on the brink of a demographic disaster. The total fertility rate is below 1.2, which is a disaster. It's a catastrophe for any nation. Excuse me. The Chinese economy is not doing well. It is no longer projected to surpass the US economy. If at I mean the earliest it could possibly happen is 2067, but most likely it will never happen, because once the demographic disaster really kicks in, the economy is gonna contract even further. So China is staring down the barrel. It's no longer going to get rich before it gets poor. It's going to get rich before it gets old. It's going to get old before it gets rich, and it may never get really rich. So China is in dire straits. It is going to go towards a really bad time. By the end of the 21st century, China's population could be half of what it is today, and most of them could be elderly people. That's a disaster. Now imagine this scenario for 2024. A weak Indian government comes to power, a coalition government led by God knows who. I think we can imagine who it could be if it happens. The great dream of the West, that Mr. Modi loses the election and somebody else comes to power as part of a very weak khichdi government, coalition government. Imagine that hypothetical scenario, which will not happen, but imagine it. Such a weak, pliable, malleable coalition government is guaranteed to be very strongly pro USA. It may be to some extent pro China also, but it will be much more pro USA. This is a scenario that did not exist until the Chinese, everything went wrong for China. They would also have preferred a weak coalition government. But today they would rather prefer, in the new scenario where they are today, the Chinese would rather prefer a strong Indian government that stands up to the US. Because we know that the US wants to use India to counterbalance China and play their geopolitical games, and further US geopolitical interest in the Indo-Pacific, including using things like the Quad grouping of nations and other things. So if there's a weak Indian government in power after 24, then the US will be able to use India fully as an extension of US foreign policy. But if Mr. Modi comes back to power in 24, that won't happen. So in this new scenario, it is now clear that the Chinese actually would prefer Mr. Modi to stay on in power. They don't want a weak government to come to power in India in 2024. Because Mr. Modi is not going to launch an invasion of China. As long as the Chinese behave, and if they demarcate the border, the issue will be over. That's what Mr. Modi wants. Yes, India may have to agree to recognize Tibet as part of China. and we may agree to freezing the border wherever it is, the LAC as the international border. Some such agreement could be arrived at if the Chinese are in their serious about demarcating the India-China border. So, so the Chinese, I would say now in this new scenario, would very much prefer Mr. Modi to come back to power, because Mr. Modi is known to stand up to the US and to the West. And Mr. Modi has made it amply clear he's not pro-China, anti-China. He even went out of his way to woo Mr. Xi Jinping during his first term, and to convey to Mr. Xi Jinping that India was willing to cooperate with China. It was Chinese intransigence that led to the current border conflict. So the Chinese behave when they are willing to demarcate the border, the India-China issue will be over, and things may even be open. Possibilities may be open for India-China cooperation. Obviously, India cannot afford to let its guard down with China, because the Chinese have this expansionist mindset. But yeah, things could go. But think the relationship can be improved significantly. But that will only happen if there is an independent minded government in India in 2024. So the scenario has changed now. I believe the Chinese now would very much prefer Mr. Modi to come back to power in 24. They would want Mr. Modi to win the 24 election, because in the other case, if a weak government comes to power, it will be much more pro US than pro China. And that is going to be a disaster for China in the current scenario. So yeah, that's the new deal with within the India China relationship. That's how rapidly things are changing. That's how rapidly the entire geopolitical scenario is changing in the second decade, in the third decade of the 21st century. Interesting days are here.